Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Greg Hansen, and I'm part of the strategy team here at HUB24. Our subject today is philanthropy, and we'll be discussing topics such as how to navigate client discussions, the trigger events, types of giving structures, and tax management. And our objective is to provide you with the knowledge and the tools required to provide advice to your clients in this area. Our expert today is Susan Chenoweth. Susan is the head of Philanthropic Services at Elston and has more than 20 years' experience in financial services. She has a deep understanding of social investment and was previously the head of the Australian Philanthropic Services Foundation. She currently leads Elston's philanthropy offering, supporting the firm's asset managers and financial advisors to develop impactful and strategic giving programs for their clients. Welcome, Susan.
Thanks, Greg. Nice to be here.
So firstly, why do you think philanthropy is important to clients today?
Well, I think perhaps if we just quickly make the distinction, Greg, between charity and philanthropy, we often think of charity as really a response to pressing issues in our community. We've seen some big responses over recent years in Australia to things like floods and bushfires. And if we contrast that to philanthropy, philanthropy is often characterised as more proactive, strategic responses to more complex problems in our society. Things like homelessness, domestic violence, environmental challenges. And these things often require, I guess, more sustained levels of support. And this support is often given through structures. So with that in mind, philanthropy is certainly growing in Australia, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, wealth in Australia is growing. So we're certainly seeing the growth of that affluent Australian segment of our population. So not in every sector, but certainly in that top 30%, wealth is growing at one of the highest rates in the world, on par with Hong Kong and Singapore. And we anticipate seeing that grow even further with the impending intergenerational wealth transfer. And of course, not surprisingly, the more wealth people have, the more inclined that they are to give more generously when they have more than enough to meet their own needs and the needs of their family. They tend to give more generously to philanthropy. We know this to be true in Australia. Affluent Australians tend to give 1.5 times the rate of average Australians. And I'm seeing, I guess, a real interest in giving in a more strategic way. So there's a growing sort of recognition that you can regard your philanthropic investments in the same way as you regard your financial investments. So gone are the days of most wealthy donors writing a cheque for charity or waiting and leaving a large bequest through their will. We, of course, still see that happening, but more and more I'm seeing clients wanting to be very thoughtful about the way that they give, how they can use all of the assets at their disposal to give in the most effective way to make the biggest impact that they can. And finally, I think another key factor is the growing prevalence of tax-effective giving structures that are available to people in Australia today. So, you don't need to be Bill and Melinda Gates to give strategically through a foundation. Most people, whatever their financial assets, have access to giving structures like giving circles, community foundations, and sub-funds within community foundations or public ancillary funds. So these mechanisms really provide the benefits of structured philanthropy to a very wide range of people in Australia. It's much more accessible than it has been in previous years. So I guess the key point here is that more people are giving, more people can afford to give, and they really want to make it count.
Want a bit more control over where their money goes. Like, is that a fair summary?
Absolutely, yeah. Want to be in the driver's seat in terms of, how they use their assets, retain those assets, often in a structure, to be able to give and not only grant with those assets, but also to use the assets themselves to make a positive contribution through, finding investments that are actually aligned with the mission of their giving, or at the very least, screening out the types of investments that might be actually detracting from them doing good.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we will come to tax effectiveness and different structures, but before we get there, if the demand is there, why do you think some financial advisors shy away from discussing philanthropy with their clients?
Yeah, well, look, I think there are certainly more advisors assisting their clients with their giving than there have been in the past, but many don't. And it is unfortunate because, in fact, the research tells us that clients do look to their trusted advisor as a very important source of philanthropic giving information. In fact, they regard their advisor as the most important source of information, second only to their spouse. And there are a couple of reasons, I think, why advisors don't support their clients in this space. The first is that many advisors feel that they just don't have the technical information that they need. Things like information on what philanthropic structures there are available in Australia, the types of tax concessions available to be able to advise their clients effectively. And I think the second area is that advisors just don't always feel comfortable having those sort of personal values-led conversations with their clients. They often far prefer to stay in the area of purely financial discussions. Interestingly, though, research tells us that those advisors who do talk to their clients about philanthropy can also do better. So when surveyed, clients often will say, we wish our advisor would discuss this with us earlier in our relationship. And advisors often do tend to focus on that technical side of giving, the tax and the structures, as we spoke about before, whereas clients are really wanting to talk about their personal interest in giving, how they can leave a legacy, what it is that they're passionate about, and what it is that they want to give back to.
That's great. So other than client demand, what's in it for advisors? Why should they consider philanthropic advice as part of their offer?
I think there's a really clear business case for advisors, Greg, and I think, when we do talk to advisors who do actively advise their clients in this space, they say it's good for business. It's an opportunity to really deepen your relationship with your client and often have in relationships with their extended family, because if a client is getting involved in philanthropy and if they do go down the track of setting up a structure or planning a family legacy, they often involve children, parents, siblings, and it's an opportunity to form relationships with those wider members of the family. It also is a great aid in establishing new business. Interestingly, 40% of high net worth customers have said that they would be more likely to select an advisor who is knowledgeable in philanthropy. So it's certainly of interest to clients and a way to really get to know your clients more deeply.
So basically, it's good for clients and it's good for your business.
Absolutely.
So if advisors want to identify potential philanthropists, what does the typical philanthropist look like?
Well, I think it might be surprising, who is a philanthropist in your client base, and it's often not who you think it is. They can take all forms. I often give the example of one of my clients, Cheryl, who is a retired nurse. She has no dependents, and she, has a modest wealth, but she wanted to give back on her retirement, to give back to her nursing profession. And so we worked with her to establish a sub-fund in a public ancillary fund. And really the outcome for her, with as little as $50,000, she's been able to create an endowment, a lasting legacy, where she actually has provided a bursary in perpetuity that gives back to nursing students, and she plans to leave almost the entirety of her estate through that sub-fund in future years, which will allow her to leave an even greater legacy. So I think she's a great example of someone who's very passionate about giving, who doesn't necessarily have millions to set up a foundation, but can still be philanthropic in a meaningful way for herself.
It's a great case study. How does an advisor identify those potential clients or identify what the triggers might be?
Well, I think really my biggest piece of advice here is to have the conversation with your clients, to have it early, have it on an ongoing basis, because for clients, really the reasons or the motivations for giving are almost always to give back, to pursue a passion or a personal interest that they have. So understanding, what your clients are interested in and passionate about is going to uncover those clients who have an interest in giving back. But of course, wanting to give and actually taking the step of giving are two very different things. So often the act of giving will be prompted by a trigger event. And this, it could be a financial event such as the sale of a business, retirement, or a significant capital gain. Or it might be a significant change in personal circumstances. That might be such things as marriage or the loss of a loved one, or experience of an illness within the family, which can often stop people and encourage them to think about giving back.
Are you noticing that there are specific themes at the moment that are changing that people are passionate about and want to give back to?
Yes, definitely. I think it's an interesting question, and I'll give you a two-part answer to this. I think, yes, absolutely, you're right. At a macro level, there are trends, and I think they're often very reflective of the concerns and the trends in our broader community. Things like climate change, environmental issues, and domestic and family violence are things that I'm seeing a real increase in interest in giving back to. But I think the second answer to this question is that really giving is so personal. So really I find that clients will, often give back to things that they have developed an interest in over many, many years, over their life's journey. So, often people will give back to things like preserving cultural heritage, or responding or supporting medical research into a disease area that has affected their family, for example. Those kind of really personal aspects of giving, I think, will endure beyond the trends.
You can see why it's so different to the usual, quite not mechanical, but it's a very different conversation about someone's values and their priorities than it is about their financial situation.
Yes, which is, why some advisors do, struggle to start that conversation. But it doesn't need to be complicated. I think just asking that question, do you give? Do you have particular interests in charity? Would you like some help with this? Have you thought about purpose of wealth and leaving a legacy? Those kind of conversation starters can really just get the ball rolling. And of course, there are different ways that advisors can build their skills, build their knowledge of the philanthropic sector. Elston has a advisor training course that is CPD accredited through the FPA. It's a couple of hours long, and it's a good example of a way of advisors upskilling in this space. Philanthropy Australia also has another course that's available through the FPA as well. So there are a few different avenues to really build those skills, build that knowledge, to build the confidence, I guess, in having those conversations.
Excellent. Ask the question is the is the tip that I got out of that one. So let's turn to more of the how clients are giving. What are some of the most common structures that facilitate a planned giving program?
Yeah, well, we have touched on a couple of those already. So some of those sort of pooled giving structures like giving circles, community foundations are growing in popularity. But I think I'll spend a few minutes just talking on a few of the key, most popular structures that are in use in Australia at the moment. And they are private ancillary funds, public ancillary funds, and charitable trusts. And we'll pop up a couple of slides just to help illustrate these points. And we'll start with private ancillary funds. Now, essentially, private ancillary funds are private trust structures that can be established by a client. They're regulated by the ACNC, the Australian Charity and Not-for-Profit Commission, and the ATO. And a client would establish their own trustee company. They would become a director of that trustee, and the group of directors would require at least one responsible person. So the client has a lot of control, but also a lot of responsibility for the administration, the governance, and the running of the foundation. But all donations into a private ancillary fund are 100% tax deductible, and they will sit in an endowed, typically in a long-term endowed investment portfolio. And this is where their advisor would typically advise them and guide them in the development of an investment strategy and the implementation and the ongoing management of that investment portfolio. And the client can then grant out to charity at least a minimum of 5% of the assets within the foundation, and they can grant to any kind of deductible gift recipient, item 1, endorsed charity in Australia. And there are many, many thousands of those charities. So there's a lot of choice and flexibility in how that money is granted. So we would generally recommend that a client consider establishing a private ancillary fund if they have at least 1 million in assets that they wish to donate into a structure like that. And if we contrast that to a public ancillary fund, a public ancillary fund is quite similar in the sense that it is regulated again by the ACNC and the ATO. There is the requirement to establish a trustee company, but the benefit in a public fund for a client is that a public fund is already established. There's an external trustee. The trustee is responsible for the ongoing investment of assets, and the client can make a 100% tax deductible donation into a public fund, but into a sub fund within that public ancillary fund, and they can do that at a much lower entry point. Elston has a public ancillary fund. Ours is quite typical of the sector, with a minimum investment or donation into a sub fund of $25,000. And then the client must, or the foundation must, grant out to charities, deductible gift recipient charities, at least 4% of the investment balance on an ongoing basis. So there are a few differences, a lot of similarities, but the key differences between a private and a public ancillary fund are, first of all, the setup time and cost. Private ancillary funds would take 4 to 6 weeks to set up. There are costs associated with setting up of trust deeds, lodging those with the ACNC and the ATO to gain charitable status. Fees for establishment would sort of range between sort of $4,000 to $8,000. In contrast, a public fund setup time is simply a couple of days, and there are no establishment costs. donation size we've spoken about, typically 1 million as a sort of entry point to a private fund, public fund much less. And a big difference, of course, is control. So a private ancillary fund, the client has the opportunity to have a lot more control over the assets within the fund, whereas within a public fund, they're really outsourcing that responsibility to the trustee of the public fund. Clearly, a lot of difference in terms of ongoing responsibilities for admin and compliance. A lot of clients love the opportunity to be able to give and just simply focus on their giving within a public fund, because they don't need to worry about administering, making sure they're compliant with legislation, etc. So I think they're the sort of key characteristics or differences. And private and public ancillary funds are very popular because, of course, donations into those funds are tax deductible. So that can be a significant advantage and a key driver or trigger for many clients who might be giving in response to a significant capital gain event. So the third potential structure, which is not as common but quite commonly used in Australia, is a charitable trust. Now, a charitable trust can be established through a will at the time of someone's death or during the time that they are living. There's a lot more flexibility around what kind of charities you can grant to with a charitable trust. But on the downside, donations into a charitable trust are not tax deductible. So there's a real trade-off there between flexibility and tax deductibility. So every client is different and they are going to have different considerations, including their motivations, their giving interests, the amount that they want to give and the amount of time that they want to devote to their giving. And I guess their willingness to take on governance responsibilities. And those kind of things are going to determine what is the right solution or structure that will work for any particular client. So I think I've given you a little bit of insight into this area. It's not always straightforward. It does require some strategic input to do this well. But certainly there are a range of different structures available to assist clients who want to give through structures.
That's great. You mentioned tax a couple of times there in different ways that different structures are taxed. In your experience, how important a factor is tax to people who are interested in philanthropy?
Yeah, look, a tax isn't almost never the driving motivator for philanthropy, but it does play a huge role. Tax planning can often be a trigger for philanthropic giving, and in my experience, almost every client that I work with who has decided to set up a foundation, often they've wanted to do it for a long time, they've been thinking about it for a while, but they may have had a significant capital gain event or the sale of a business, which means that it can offer some really significant tax benefits that can be very beneficial at a particular time or stage. So that can be a really key consideration. Another thing to consider too is that in all of those structures that we spoke about, public and private funds and charitable trusts, by investing or putting significant assets into a foundation that has charitable status, those investments grow within a tax-free, tax concession environment. So that's another really big advantage in doing so. It helps clients grow their philanthropic nest egg at a much greater rate because they don't need to pay tax on those assets.
Yeah, well, so you've obviously been involved in philanthropy at very senior levels for a long time. What lessons have you learned that would be helpful for advisors?
I think I would encourage advisors, as we've talked about, to have that conversation with their clients to not think that it is only their very wealthy clients who might be interested in giving. Always ask the question, because people from all walks of life have a motivation to give. I think we should always remember, you know, 3 in every 5 Australians give to charity every year. So there's, you know, it's very commonplace within our community. Anyone who's new to giving, I would always encourage them to really get involved in whatever way they can within the philanthropic community. I think it's a great way to learn about giving effectively and strategically, learning more about the different charities that are out there, and provides opportunities to collaborate and potentially co-fund pool philanthropic assets or grants with other grant makers, so that your funding actually has even greater impact. And there's a range of ways that people can get involved in grant making networks, such as the Women's Donor Network, the Australian Environmental Grant Makers Network. Philanthropy Australia has a great network, of course, as the peak body for philanthropy in Australia. Elston has a growing and great philanthropic community, and we often offer very publicly accessible events around strategic giving in particular cause areas as well. So I'd encourage them to, you know, join the community, learn, get involved. And I think often a problem that some donors have is actually narrowing down their giving focus. So they might think, and I think it's a good thing to, you know, explore and discover your giving interests initially. But if you give to too many things, you're really diluting your impact. And often it is much more impactful to try and narrow that focus and focus your giving into a particular area. So that would be another recommendation that I would have.
And given that this is so important to many clients, if an advisor wanted to integrate philanthropy into their practice, how should they go about that?
Well, we talked about, you know, just asking the question, exploring philanthropic interests with clients, but once they've done that, and if they do find that clients do have particular interest in philanthropy, I guess they've got a couple of choices then. I mean, if they want to build their philanthropic advisory knowledge to the extent that they can advise their clients on those range of different giving structures and effective ways of giving, that's an option for them. Or they can always draw in third-party experts to either, you know, work with them behind the scenes or directly with their clients in those areas of establishing and implementing structures, or guiding clients on the most impactful way of giving. But there will always be a role for the advisor as that trusted advisor of their client, who knows their client best and has that ongoing responsibility to provide tax advice, strategic advice to their client. And in the case of a client establishing a structure, there will always be that need for advisory work in terms of ongoing management of the investment portfolio. So there are a range of ways that an advisor can be involved to varying degrees in the establishment and then the ongoing management of their clients' philanthropy.
Yeah, so the message I'm getting is it's certainly an opportunity to deepen and strengthen client relationships, and there's a lot of support out there. It's good for your business as well. So it sounds like a bit of a no-brainer, actually. Given that it's the case, what are the key ideas that you want advisors to take away from the discussion today?
Look, I really think the most important point is that asking your clients about philanthropy is good for your business. It's an opportunity to really get to know your clients, and it can add enormous value to your clients, to those that are already giving, but to those that you may not think might be philanthropic, or they themselves might not think that they can be. They might not have all the information they need to be able to give back in a way that they would like to do. help is at hand. There are a range of different services available, including the Elston Philanthropic Advisory Service. So I think I would really encourage advisors to build their skills so that they are equipped with the knowledge that they need to have that conversation with their clients and really benefit from deeper relationships with their clients.
It seems like a really important opportunity, an important service to offer to both existing and to new clients.
Absolutely. We certainly are seeing a growing demand for these services and a really growing interest from clients in setting up structures and using them in a whole range of different ways, whether it's to work with their next generation, their children and grandchildren, transferring values or even upskilling them in preparing them to manage family wealth, or to simply give back in a way that they've always wanted to do and now have the opportunity to do. So to be able to help your clients in all of those things is, it's such a value add.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. It's been a really valuable conversation. Thank you for your time and your insights.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Greg.
Anytime. That completes our webinar today. For more information about philanthropic advice, you can contact Susan at Elston or speak to your BDM. Thanks very much.